Long Island, Staten Island, Harlem, Yonkers, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Wall Street in New York City, New York, are just a few names that remind us of the city's original name, New Amsterdam. The territory claimed in 1609 by English explorer Henry Hudson on behalf of Dutch East India Company merchants and lost to the English some 60 years later has a turbulent history of rivalry, betrayal, disaster, and wars. Many, many wars. History likes to tell us that New Amsterdam was an inconsequential gathering of nobodies and didn't become a thriving settlement until the English took over. Well, as they say, history is written by the victors. Let's delve deep into the Dutch origins of New York City and discover New Netherlands' notable influence on American culture today. I am Yvette, this is Defragged History. Thank you for tuning in to episode 1 of the story of New Amsterdam, how it started, how it ended, and everything in between. Please support the channel by liking, subscribing, sharing, and letting me know your thoughts as they happen in the comments section. Links to my sources, the music, and other ways to support the channel are in the description. And now, let's make all the pieces fit. To understand how and why New Amsterdam became New York City, we have to go back in time. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived... Wait, maybe not that far back? In 1555, Rey Felipe II de España became the Lord of the Netherlands, a collection of 17 relatively independent provinces, or states, which included present-day Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, and parts of Germany and France. King Felipe II, who lived in Spain, ruled the global Spanish Empire, with colonies in the East and West Indies. In the Netherlands, Lord Felipe left stadholders, a kind of governor in charge of each state, and one governor-general to rule them all. But the Lord, God's chosen representative on earth, reigned supreme. King Felipe, a dedicated Roman Catholic, hated seeing the Reformation sweep through northwestern Europe and converting his subjects to the new flavor in town, the Protestant religion. For King Felipe, Protestants were heretics and heretics were doomed. The king, a shepherd tending to his lost flock, vowed to save his subjects from hellfire and squash this newfangled religion in all his lands. No one was allowed to be or behave like a Protestant, or else risk being burnt at the stake. That policy didn't sit well with the relatively tolerant Dutch, but when their economy suffered, and Felipe also trampled all the state's constitutions, his subjects got ever more restless. On September 10, 1566, the whole thing blew up in a violent iconoclasm, with Protestants destroying the interiors of Roman Catholic churches. King Felipe matched the rebels' rage by sending General Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Grand Duke of Alba, to the rebellious Netherlands with an army to restore peace in all the lands. The stadholders had already restored the peace, but Alba arrested many rebels, put them on trial, and sentenced several to death. The new Governor-General quickly put the fear of God and King back into the people of the Low Countries. Many nobles fled. One such refugee happened to be the most powerful noble of the Low Countries and stadholder of the most wealthy states, Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht, Prince Willem of Orange, Count of Nassau. In 1568, the Prince of Orange declared war on the Duke of Alba and from his parents' home in Nassau invaded the country, hoping to stop the Governor-General's reign of terror and save the citizens from his wrath. The war that would ultimately last 80 years began. If you want to know the full story of this conflict, and it is full, be sure to check out my 80 Years War series on this channel. Not everyone was on board with the prince's cause. The war divided the 17 states into the rebel North and the loyal South, roughly today's Netherlands, and Belgium and Luxembourg. The southern states allied in the Union of Utrecht, the rebel states allied in the Union of Utrecht. In 1581, the Union of Utrecht states agreed their lord had disobeyed God and had not behaved like a shepherd but a tyrant. They felt this allowed them to remove King Felipe from power and issued the Plakkaat van Verlatingen, the Act of Abjuration, kicking their lord to the curb. They would look for a new one in Europe. The king banished the Prince of Orange from the Low Countries. From now on, anyone who helped him would die. He also offered a large reward for anyone who brought Willem in, dead or alive. Many assassins tried, but in 1584, one succeeded in killing the prince at his home in Delft. King Felipe figured that would be the end of it. After all, he held Willem's eldest son and heir, Philips Willem, captive in Spain. Well, that didn't go his way. Prince Willem's second son, Count Maurits of Nassau, teamed up with one of Willem's top advisors, the lawyer Johan van Oldenbarneveld, and took over the war. The rebel states got a lot of on-again, off-again help from fellow Spain haters England and France, who sent money and troops. But no one wanted to become their lord. No one wanted to rule rebellious subjects. So, in the end, they figured they'd rule themselves. The Staten-Generaal, the States General with representatives of all the independent rebel states, became the Lord of the Netherlands. The government's chief advisor was the Landsadvocaat Johan van Oldenbarneveld. But over time, the Attorney General functioned like a prime minister and the country became a republic, the Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands. Each state now appointed their own stadholder, but he only had to take orders from the Lord, the States General. Count Maurits was elected stadholder of 5 of the 7 rebel states, with his cousin Count Willem Lodewijk of Nassau ruling the other 2. Maurits was also commander-in-chief of the state's armies and navies. The man was a military genius. He and his cousin drastically reorganized the armies, and with this new modern army, they wrested city after city from Spanish rule. Meanwhile, King Felipe went back to the drawing board to brainstorm other creative solutions to end the rebellion. Well, since the rebels funded the war with the taxed income from the wealthy merchants of Holland and Zeeland, he should just end their trade. Europeans love them spices from Asia. They use them for cooking, preserving food, making medicine, and religious ceremonies. These spices were transported over land, but the use of middlemen made nutmeg, pepper, cinnamon, and cloves very expensive. The Portuguese discovered a sea route to Asia, cut out the middlemen, and shipped goods directly to their ports. There, Dutch merchants bought them and the salt needed for the fishing industry, repackaged them, and sold them across Europe at massive profits. These huge profits were taxed, and these taxes paid for the war against the Spanish Empire. King Felipe, who had just become King of Portugal through some shaky lineage and a bit of violence, banned the Dutch merchants from Portuguese harbors. Boom! Now the rebels could no longer fund the war. Ha ha. Well, that didn't go his way. The Dutch merchants ignored the Treaty of Tordesillas, in which Spain and Portugal divvied up the East and West Indies between them, and decided they'd find their own way to Asia. First, the Dutch attempted to find a shortcut east via the Fretum Arcticum, the Arctic Strait. But 3 expeditions failed on account of all the ice they kept getting stuck in. Meanwhile, King Felipe realized the harbor ban only hurt him and his merchants, and he dropped the trade restrictions like a hot potato. They weren't yet eating because probably poison. The English, at the time not much of a seafaring people, would you believe it, saw a few of Dutch mapmaker extraordinaire Petrus Plancius's newly drawn world maps and were inspired to find that North Passage as well. A group of investors formed a sort of business club called Merchant Adventurers of England for the discovery of lands, territories, isles, dominions, and seigniories unknown. The first attempt failed, but it launched a lucrative trade deal with the Muscovy, now Russians, and the investors made bank. The company with the long name was rebranded as the Muscovy Company and, well, stopped looking for that elusive Northeast Passage. Meanwhile, other English merchants found the southern route, and in December 1600, they pooled their money and created a joint venture, the East India Company. In January 1599, King Felipe III, mere months after his father's death, once again closed the Portuguese harbors to the rebel Dutch merchants, thinking it would speed up the end of the war. Well, that didn't go his way. Dutch explorers had stolen some intel from the Portuguese and found the southern route east. After a rough start, with lots of miscommunication and some killing, they made trade deals with the locals. Now everyone and their rebel mother headed out to Asia, and a ton of shipping companies got involved in the spice trade. However, this created competition, lowered prices, and suppressed profit margins, which messed up the collection of state taxes needed to fund the war. Attorney General Johan van Oldenbarneveld got an idea. Bring a bunch of rivaling shipping companies together under one banner and take over the world. Mwahaha. In 1602, de Generale Verenigde Geoctrooieerde Compagnie, a.k.a. de Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, a.k.a. the Dutch United East India Company, a.k.a. the VOC, was founded. The VOC ended up being the most wealthy company in the world ever. Bonds and shares became accessible to everyone who had a few bucks to spare and shared in the company's profits. This whole setup was the precursor of our modern corporations. The merchants' fleet doubled as a war fleet and had orders to destroy any Spanish or Portuguese ships they saw en route to Asia. Spain, and by extension Portugal, were going through some things. They faced struggles locally, economically, and socially, and had no means to stop either East India Company. And the Europeans who were in Spanish or Portuguese started eyeing the West Indies. Spain's massive income from their colonies in South America, the Caribbean, and Florida funded their war with the rebel Netherlands and everyone else. But they weren't all that interested in North America. In 1585, the English founded a colony in North America out of the line of sight of the Spanish. That Roanoke colony vanished, but in 1607, Captain John Smith established Jamestown, Virginia, named after King James I of England, the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I's successor. Meanwhile, the French put down roots at Port Royal in Quebec, and the Dutch merchants wanted some of that as well. The wealthy Antwerp refugee merchant Willem Usseling said, "Let's make a West India Company. Have a few colonies with farms, start up some trade, strengthen the Republic's independence, open up another war front on the other side of the world, and while we're at it, convert the tribal people to Calvinism." Johan van Oldenbarneveld was open to the idea, not so much the colonies bit. He wasn't looking to extend Netherlands territory, but for a trading company/war machine, disrupting Spanish trade and intercepting their silver fleets. Ka-ching! He felt that with a West India Company, the Spaniards will be driven out of all those regions and deprived of their traffic. Thus will the great wolf's teeth be pulled out, and we need have no farther fear of his biting again. Meanwhile, the English-Russia trade had dried up, and the Muscovy Company returned to their original goal, to find a faster way east via the North Passage. They hired a particularly daring and ambitious captain, Henry Hudson. Captain Henry Hudson's early history is a bit of a blur. He first appears in the history books as a 40-year-old captain, so he must have been in service for years. Hudson, married with 3 sons, was obsessed with finding a North Passage to the east. Many had tried and failed, but he was convinced he was the chosen one. He would find that passage, and the Muscovy Company hired him to do just that. There were 2 options: northeast over what is today Russia, or northwest over what is today Canada. Well, Hudson considered a third option: straight across, over the pole, over the top of the world. In April 1607, he and his crew of 12 went on his first recorded journey on a 70-foot-long ship, the Hopewell. They braved the fog and ice, lived off bear and seal meat, and, this is always fun, a whale almost surfaced under their ship. But on July 6th, when they got a little past 80 degrees latitude, Hudson said, "This morning we saw that we were compassed in with ice in abundance, and this I can assure at present, by this way there is no passage." Amazingly, he made it home in one piece, with the crew being a little mutinous and plotting to throw him overboard and all. No one considered Hudson's attempt a failure. It was just another route to strike off the list. Now tell me about them whales you saw. There were many? Yeah, plenty. Oh, good. So the English launched the highly profitable whaling industry and drove the whales to near extinction. The Muscovy Company told Hudson to try again. The captain plotted his journey all winter and set off again in the Hopewell in April 1608. He was partial to the Northwest Passage, but he tried the northeast first. But after hitting the islands at Nova Zembla, he wrote, "It was so full of ice that you will hardly think it." So he tore up his company's orders, turned the Hopewell around, and headed west. This journey was equally unpleasant. When Hudson finally caught on that his crew was on the verge of mutiny and ready to chuck him overboard again, the captain gave up and returned to London. He immediately plotted the next attempt. 3rd time's a charm. Hudson's friend, John Smith, who had founded the Jamestown colony in Virginia the year before, told him that, according to the Indians, there was a river or sea north of Virginia beyond which lay a great ocean. Since the route lay farther south, the weather would be far more pleasant. Probably. Hudson got Dutch mapmaker, astronomer, and VOC co-founder Reverend Petrus Plancius to give him a peek into English navigator George Weymouth's journals in which he described the American East Coast. A few years earlier, Weymouth had reached the mouth of the now Hudson River, whoa, spoilers, but never explored it on account of the, and I quote, imbecility of his crew, which forced him to sail home. In August 1608, Captain Hudson presented his plans to the Muscovy Company in London. Short answer, no. Long answer, hell no. The records of the meeting were destroyed in the Great Fire of London of 1666, so we don't know why. Could it be that Hudson was too much of a cocky son of a bitch? Could it be that he couldn't follow orders? Could it be that he needed to brush up on his people skills and not have a mutinous crew like always? Whatever the reason, and despite Hudson having given the company good intel and massive investment opportunities, they rejected his plan. Captain Hudson left the building, ready to sink into one of his deep depressions when a man stopped him on the street. The Dutch wanted a word. The war between the Republic and Spain, going on for 32 years and counting, was costing both entirely too much money. Spain's funds were running so low, and their successes were so few and far between, that King Felipe was forced to at least attempt to make peace with his rebel subjects. The Dutch leaders, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt and Count Maurits van Nassau, weren't sure Spain was serious. But okay, sure, let's meet. In the Republic, half the people were sick and tired of the war, and the other half worried Spain would never keep its word, because it never had. In April 1607, the parties arranged a ceasefire, starting May 4th. Only on land though, not at sea, nor in the Indies. The day after the agreement, the Spanish fleet got such an ass-whooping in the Bay of Gibraltar, courtesy of Dutch Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk, that the Spanish were near breaking point. Please stop! In February 1608, after a ton of haggling, protocol issues, and other gripes, the peace negotiations finally got underway. The Dutch partners in war, England and France, joined the talks. The demands on both sides were great. Among other things, Spain and Portugal were hell-bent on removing the Dutch from Asia. England was like, same. France was like, ditto. All the kings wanted to have a decent shot at making their own trade deals in both Indies. But the Dutch were like, nuts to that. Nutmeg for the win. Peace without trade was war without killing. Without trade, the Republic couldn't feed its citizens, they'd have no money for a navy, their merchants would constantly be under attack, kingdoms would invade them left and right, and they wouldn't hand over the poor little smooshy-faced locals in the colonies to their royal wrath. Sure, we'll compromise. We won't expand our trade routes to, say, China. The Republic, meanwhile, demanded to be declared a sovereign nation. But Spain, England, and France were like, as if. The Dutch were like, totally. While the talks dragged on, report after report poured in of VOC conquests in the East Indies. The Spanish were practically on their knees begging the Dutch to make peace. Stop trading in Asia. We'll open up the harbors in Portugal again, please. You don't even have a right to trade in the East or West. And that goes for you too, England and France. Well, Hugo de Groot, take it away. The 26-year-old smartass pensionary of Rotterdam sweetly explained to the Spanish that trade on the open seas couldn't be controlled by one country. According to de Groot, the air and the sea were rex nullis, belonging to no king. Plus, the sea was free, mare liberum. Dude just casually dropped the concept of international waters. But Spain refused to make any concessions, and the negotiations were over. Peace out. England and France suggested, how about a long truce? What do you say? Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was on board. Count Maurits wasn't a fan. Restarting a war after a long truce would be hard. That is, if the Republic didn't fall apart in the meantime. The only thing united about these United States was the war. But despite the Count's best efforts to stop it, truce talks got underway. It dawned on the VOC merchants that once there was a truce, the Spanish and Portuguese merchant ships would have free rein. Their profits would tank, their stocks would be close to worthless. If only someone could find them that shortcut, the North Passage. Hello, Henry Hudson. Lord knows how Emmanuel van Meteren knew Henry Hudson's plans to find the North Passage had been rejected by the Muscovy Company, but he did. The 72-year-old Dutch consul in London told Hudson that a few VOC merchants wanted him to do the thing he did, find the Northern Passage to Asia. The captain was like, "Where do I sign?" He arrived in Amsterdam a few weeks later to have a little chat with a Dutchman who had money to burn. "So, you're close, huh?" "Yeah, real close." But the Dutch merchants weren't the only ones headhunting him. The Spanish, French, and English envoys still in The Hague 30 miles south on account of the truce talks all sent spies to Amsterdam to check on Hudson. Since the talks with the VOC Amsterdam chamber weren't going smoothly, Hudson was like, "Hey," to the French. Once the Dutch found out about all the plots to nab the English captain from them, they raced to get Hudson to sign on the dotted line. And on January 8, 1609, he did. On April 6, 1609, Henry Hudson and a half-Dutch, half-English crew of 16 set sail on the 85-foot Halve Maan Half Moon. The Halve Maan, unlike the bulky VOC return ships, was a vlieboot or flyboat, a slender and flexible ship with a shallow draft, perfect for exploring. The Dutch merchants gave Captain Hudson orders to find a northeastern route. They knew the captain wanted to explore the northwestern route and warned him in his orders to think of discovering no other routes or passages. Captain Hudson dutifully sailed north along Norway's coast, but once caught in a snowstorm, the crew was ready to chuck him overboard again. Hudson hung a left and pulled the crew. The northwest or more southwest route. More southwest it was. Let's find that southern river his buddy John Smith talked about. The journey to the West Indies took about 3 to 4 months as opposed to the 9 months to a year it took to get to the East Indies. They sailed through thick fog and storms, and around Nova Scotia, gale-force winds snapped their foremast. Hudson stayed a week in Penobscot Bay in today's Maine to fix them a new one. The locals saw them and rowed at them in 2 canoes. Seeming glad of our coming, we gave them trifles and they ate and drank with us. One of them spoke a bit of French. Their tribe traded with the French. And then, some of Hudson's crew, realizing how defenseless the Indians were, went ashore and robbed them at musket point. It seemed Hudson lacked the power to keep his men in line. On August 28th, the Halve Maan entered a bay and sailed up what Hudson called the South River, today the Delaware River. But he ran into shoals and sandbanks and knew this couldn't be that wide, deep channel to Asia the Indians talked about. So, the Halve Maan followed the coast north. And a few days later, on September 2nd, 1609, at 3 p.m., the Halve Maan entered a bay fed by 3 large rivers, the Raritan, the Narrows, and Rockaway Inlet. Entering a new world. For them, anyway. Henry Hudson had arrived in the land of the Mohican, Mohawk, Lenape, and other East Coast native tribes. The Indians and their European visitors matched in skill, smarts, stubbornness, and cruelty, but their cultures, government systems, rights, privileges, and values were different, even from each other. The Mohican, Mohawk, and Lenape didn't even speak the same language. And while the Mohawk had settled in palisaded villages, the hunter-gatherer Mohican moved around. And with the Lenape, the women were in charge, with status and inheritance being passed down from the female line. On September 3rd, 1609, after careful depth soundings, the Halve Maan passed what is now called Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and anchored in the bay at 2 cables' length from the shore. The bay was surrounded by a thick forest, but they could just catch glimpses of Indian villages. The Munsee, made up of several Lenape sub-tribes with long black hair, gracefully dressed in ornamented deerskin, with colored feathers on artistically woven mantles, were calm, dignified, curious, but wary. The arrival of the large object caused confusion. Was it a fish? A dead fish? Was it a house floating on the water? Was it a giant canoe, the home of Manito, the supreme being coming to pay them a visit? Eventually, a reconnaissance crew realized it was a large house painted in various colors and filled with people of a different color to them, and their bodies were wrapped in peculiar cloth. One of them even wore a red coat all glittering with gold lace shimmering so brightly in the sunlight. Hudson. The Indians certainly heard about these explorers who brought very useful goods for trade. Some had already encountered them during visits to other tribal lands. While the Munsee were apprehensive, they were also excited to meet those visitors who'd at last arrived in their neck of the woods. Captain Hudson sent a landing party on a reconnaissance mission, and they returned with a few locals who wanted to exchange green tobacco and cornbread for knives and glass beads. For them, the gifts from these new spiritual beings, who knew what they really were, imbued them with special powers. The following morning, a group from the Halvemaan rode to the Jersey shore. The Munsee greeted them and led them to their wigwams, where they offered Hudson and his men tasty snacks, like dried currants. There were no interpreters, so they communicated with signs. Meanwhile, Hudson took all the notes. There was a whole lot of forest, with very goodly oaks and various other kinds of wood useful in shipbuilding, and an amazing array of fruit. There were also grassy meadows filled with fragrant flowers and plenty of fresh water, aka farmland. The following day, 5 of Hudson's men went to examine the bay's northern shore. As they enjoyed the smell of sweet, fragrant flowers, 2 canoes, rowed by 12 and 14 Navissink respectively, came after them. Once within arrow shot, they launched a volley into the boat, wounding 2 Englishmen and striking John Coleman in the throat. Because it had rained, their gunpowder infuses were wet and the muskets were useless. The Indians then calmly paddled home. The men managed to return to the Halvemaan, where they claimed the assault came out of nowhere, but given the crew's history, they probably robbed them, or shot at them. The crewmen buried their buddy John on a spot today called Coleman's Point at Sandy Hook. Hudson now feared the Indians would launch a full-scale assault and made bulwarks along the Halvemaan sides to keep war canoes at bay. Nothing happened. In fact, the following morning, a few canoes approached from the other part of the bay. These unarmed Indians brought corn and tobacco to exchange for useful goods and knew nothing about no hostilities. But Hudson became ever more paranoid. When a war canoe filled with about a dozen armed warriors escorted a trading canoe to the ship, he took 2 of the traders hostage. When a 2-person canoe arrived from another direction, the captain took them hostage as well. He'd used them as a shield against future assaults. But one captive broke loose, jumped overboard, and swam ashore. Still, no major assault was launched. 9 days after the expedition's arrival in the bay, a frazzled Hudson weighed anchor and sailed up the North River, today the Hudson River, or as he named it, the Mauritius River, after Count Maurits of Nassau. The Halvemaan struggled upriver on account of the weather not helping. With each stop, swarms of canoes manned by unarmed Indians emerged to trade oysters, maize, and vegetables. One morning, there was such a thick fog that the crew couldn't see a thing. One of the Indian hostages seized the moment, jumped out of one of the portholes, and swam ashore. There, they heard him holler at his captor. Probably not the kindest of words. After a few days, the Halvemaan reached the area of today's Hudson City. By now, Captain Hudson was beyond paranoid about all the natives coming aboard to trade their wares. One night, he invited a group of chiefs to his cabin, plied them with brandy to get them talking, and see if they were planning to betray him. They weren't. But one got so drunk that he fell asleep. The others thought he was poisoned and fled, leaving their buddy behind. They returned the following morning, hoping to buy his freedom with wampum, the local currency, polished shell beads on a string. But there he was, hungover but alive. He exclaimed he'd never felt so happy in all his life. Another round, fellas? Meanwhile, the river got narrower and shallower. Finally, Hudson sent a crew to row upriver, but when they reached present-day Albany, they realized this was not the way to Asia. Hudson turned the ship around and made his way back down the river. Again, every stop brought out the Indians who wanted to trade. Near present-day Castleton, an elderly chief invited Hudson to visit his home in the little settlement on the riverbank. The guests were treated like royalty and were served, among other tasty treats, freshly hunted pigeons. The chief urged Hudson to stay the night, but the captain was too paranoid. He said, "The natives are a very good people, for when they saw that I would not remain, they supposed that I was afraid of their bows, and taking the arrows, they broke them in pieces and threw them into the fire." The Halvemaan continued down the river, entertaining Indians at every stop. One day, an Indian paddled alongside the ship, grabbed a pillow and jacket hanging from a cabin window, and then paddled away. The shipmate Robert Juet grabbed his gun and shot him. The gunshot sent all Indians aboard for trade running for the canoes or jumping overboard to swim to shore, still holding the goods they wanted to buy. A sloop was launched to retrieve the stolen goods, and the crew killed several Indians. As it was returning, a lone Indian in the water, probably exhausted and drowning, grasped the gunwale. A crewman took a hatchet and cut off the man's hand with one blow. The poor man drowned. The following day, October 2nd, the Halvemaan went for anchor at the head of an island, which Juet penned down as Mannahatta. The locals called it Mannahatta Anung, the Munsee word for the place where we get bows. Although, through the years, the name has been explained in different ways. Captain Hudson seemed to feel bad about the way he had treated the friendly natives, but his paranoia got worse, probably fed by shipmate and journal keeper Robert Juet, who considered all natives treacherous and devious. When several men rowed up in a single canoe, Hudson imagined seeing one of the escaped hostages among them. He refused to let anyone on board. In response, 2 warrior-filled canoes came under the stern and shot a flight of arrows into the ship. The Halvemaan's crew returned fire with muskets, killing a few. Then some 100 Indians assembled at the point to attack the Halvemaan as she slowly drifted by, but the crew fired a board cannon at them, killing 2 of them and sending the others scrambling for the woods. When another canoe came out, the cannon was unleashed again, destroying the vessel. After 9 dead, the Indians ended the assault. A month after arrival, the Halvemaan set sail for the open seas. Hudson planned to stay the winter at Newfoundland and then try to find the Northwest Passage through Davis's Straits. But the crew was close to mutiny, ready to chuck him overboard. Again. So Hudson headed to Europe without a new route, but with plenty of trading opportunities. On November 7, 1609, against Captain Hudson's orders to head straight for Amsterdam, the Halvemaan arrived in the harbor of Dartmouth, England. Perhaps the mutinous crew forced him to pull over to let them off. The captain forwarded the news of his return to Amsterdam, and, could they send more money? Nearly all the men had disembarked and vanished. The Dutch directors were less than pleased. "What do you mean you've lost your crew? Come back at once!" Meanwhile, the English heard of Hudson's arrival. They were enraged that an Englishman was about to give the Republic a leg up in the West India trade, and detained him and the Halvemaan on account that his behavior was to the detriment of his own country. They also demanded a peek in the captain's highly classified records. Emmanuel van Meteren, the Dutch consul in London, was furious. He remained ever the diplomat in his official records. Many persons thought it rather unfair that these sailors should have been prevented from laying their accounts and reports before their employers. But in private, he wrote, "The English are inconstant, rash, vainglorious, light and deceiving, and very suspicious, especially of foreigners whom they despise. They are full of courtly and affected manners and words, which they take for gentility, civility, and wisdom." Eventually, the crew and the Halvemaan were released, and Hudson, who wasn't allowed to leave or even communicate with his VOC bosses, managed to pass his books on to Van Meteren, who forwarded the lot to Amsterdam. The VOC merchants were like, "So you achieved nothing memorable in this new way. That big river was probably in Virginia anyhow." They ditched Captain Hudson, and the English eagerly took him back. 3 wealthy aristocrats commissioned the captain to try again to discover a North Passage, east or west. West, of course. Hudson plotted a course over Canada. Do or die. There was no try. Die it was. His ship, the Discovery, got stuck in the ice, and Hudson's starving crew mutinied. They put the confused captain on a boat, along with the ill, those loyal to him, and his young son John, 6 men in all, and set them adrift without food, water, or fire. Never to be seen again. The mutinous crew was put on trial in London, but were spared when they cleverly claimed that Hudson had found the passage, but only they knew where it was. King James inaugurated them as members of a new company, the Company of the Merchants Discoverers of the Northwest Passage, but the route they never found was never found. In fact, it wasn't found until 1851 by Sir Robert McClure. In the meantime, on April 9, 1609, the truce talks between the Republic and Spain, loaded with deceptions and theatrics, were concluded, and a 12-year truce was signed. For 12 years, there would be no hostilities between the King of Spain and the Republic, on all the seas and all the land and all their countries and possessions, and between all their inhabitants, no exceptions. The Dutch had gotten their way. Sort of. They could keep their VOC, Spain considered the states as if independent, and their religious issues were shelved. The Republic only made 2 concessions. The VOC wouldn't attack the Portuguese in Asia, and they would not establish the planned West India Company during the truce. Many merchants in Holland and Zeeland were mighty pissed. The VOC now had to compete against Portugal. The company's stocks instantly tanked, the salt trade ended, and now the Dutch faced off with the Portuguese in West Africa. That's why they needed that West India Company, for trade in Africa. And in the Americas, Spain, Portugal, England and France could carve up the place among themselves, leaving the Dutch in their dust. Well, at least they had Hudson's newly discovered territory. They could create trading posts there. The land wasn't under Spanish or Portuguese control, so it didn't violate the truce. Willem Usselings thought he could still create that West India Company. But while Count Maurits was totally on board, Van Oldenbarnevelt, and by extension the state of Holland, wasn't. The merchants were like, "We hate him." Maurits, who after a few run-ins had soured on the Prime Minister, was like, "Join the club." While the United East India Company merchants weren't interested in Hudson's discovery of bountiful lands, other merchants realized the fur trade alone could make them a ton of money. Europe was in the middle of a mini ice age, and fur had become a highly prized commodity. Incidentally, this ice age was probably the reason no one could find that northern passage. Also, beaver skins provided hat makers with the much coveted felt. Felt hats were expensive, a status symbol. If you had one, you were somebody. Less than a year after Hudson's return, a few daring merchants sent out Jan Cornelissen Maay on another expedition to find the Northeast Passage. Yeah, he could turn west if he wanted. West it was, and he checked out Hudson's discovery. Well, Hudson hadn't been exaggerating in his descriptions of the bountiful lands. The explorers did a bit of trading with a few Indians and staked their claim on the Mauritius River and its surrounding land. They told the Indians they'd be back with all kinds of useful goods, and could they please get a bit of land to grow crops to feed themselves? Thanks! According to Dutch law, land could only officially be claimed if it was discovered, mapped, and occupied. So they sent out explorer merchants Adriaan Blok, Hendrik Christiansen, and Cornelis Jacobsen Maay to survey and map the swath of land between today's Virginia, the English territory, and the St. Lawrence River, where the French staked their claim. If the explorers did a good job, the States General promised them an exclusive patent to the land that the explorers named as they went along. As Blok sailed into the ocean, he saw a long narrow island to his left. He called it Lange Eiland on account of it being long, Long Island. Another island still bears his name, Block Island at Rhode Island. The first recorded non-native settler in the Dutch claimed land was Portuguese African fur trader Juan Rodriguez, a crewman who'd stayed behind after the first expedition and made the first deals on behalf of the Dutch. After the first trading vessel returned with all the goods, another 5 ships were prepared for the following year. The natives were happy to have found a market for their low-value beaver furs, for which they got all kinds of useful goods in return. Fishing hooks, axes, kettles, glassware, needles, pots, knives, and duffel, the rough wool cloth that originated in the Flemish town of Duffel, as in duffel bag. In 1613, the Dutch made their first settlement, by accident. Adriaan Blok, anchored just off the southern point of Manhattan Island, was about to go home when his ship the Tiger, caught fire and burned down to the waterline. No worries, we'll just build a new ship. Plenty of wood around. The Tiger's crew built a cozy temporary camp on the shore with a few small huts. The Native Americans showed up. "Howdy, neighbor. Need any help?" The Indians hauled the massive timbers from the forest to the shipyard and generously supplied the strangers with everything they needed. Meanwhile, they popped some corn, they had plenty of that, and watched in awe as the 44.5-foot long and 11.5-foot wide yacht arose. The Onrust, the Restless, launched early spring 1614, and Captain Blok was ready to go do some more exploring with it. Then, his crew mutinied, stole a ship of Blok's competitor merchant, and took it to go pirating in the Caribbean. Blok also established a trading house at the head of the North Mauritius, now Hudson River, and the Mohawk River, on the current Castle Island near Albany, and called it Het Fort van Nassauwen, Fort Nassau. The fort was a fortified log house, surrounded by ramparts and an 18-foot wide moat. It had cannons to defend against European pirates and privateers, not the Native Americans. Blok left one of his crewmen, Jacob Eelkens, in charge of Fort Nassau and 12 soldiers. They had to collect, store, and protect all the beaver furs being brought in as they waited for Blok's return. But Blok suddenly faced stiff competition from other trading companies of his fellow countrymen. Fortunately, no other Europeans were seen for miles. Until... In November 1613, the Dutch trading post peeps at the mouth of the North, aka Mauritius, aka Hudson River, they were using all the names until one stuck, saw an English vessel sail up into their bay and drop anchor. Captain Samuel Argall loudly claimed the territory for England. He told the man in charge, Hendrik Christiansen, to vow fealty to the English crown and pay tribute. Christiansen had no means to resist the English, whose ships' cannons could blow their little post out of the water, leaving all the trading goods up for grabs. So, Christiansen vowed fealty, paid the tribute, and wrote the Dutch merchants at home, "Hey, fellas, we have a problem here." The merchants were like, "Danger, danger! High and mighty lords of the States General," yes, that's what they're called, no joke, "please give us the exclusive right to trade in the newly charted territory, please." The States General was like, "Sure thing." And they formally named the area Nieuw Nederland, New Netherland. On October 11, 1614, they granted the Compagnie van Nieuw Nederland, the New Netherland Company, a 4-year monopoly within the 40th and 45th degrees of north latitude. If you weren't with the company, you couldn't trade there. If you did, your ships and cargo would be confiscated and you had to pay a 50,000 ducat fine. The Indians and their Dutch visitors made many deals which were lucrative for both parties. The Dutch felt it was in their interest to treat the Indians who supplied valuable goods with the deepest respect, while the Indians enthusiastically upped their beaver hunting game. In the meantime, Fort Nassau wasn't built in an ideal location. It kept getting flooded and started to fall apart. And then, in 1617, melting snow and ice swallowed the place whole. The company men relocated the fort to the mouth of the Tawasentha Creek, now Norman's Kill, in the land of the Five Nations. The Five Nations were the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, collectively called the Iroquois, or more accurately, the Haudenosaunee. With their overwhelming numbers and courage in battle, they forced the surrounding tribes to submit to them and pay them tribute. When the Dutch arrived, the Haudenosaunee were at war with the Canadian Indians, a confederacy of several tribes called the Algonquin, who had allied with the French in Canada. The Haudenosaunee weren't doing so hot in the conflict, which was fought only with bows and arrows. They were like, "Hey, Swanakins," this is what they called the newly arrived tribe of pale people, "you have these weapons of thunder and lightning. You have any of the musket, powder, and bowl for us, please?" The Dutch were like, well, if we have muskets and steel traps, we could get you way more furs. Mo furs, mo money, the merchants thought, but they had no muskets to spare. A few years later, when they supplied the tribal warriors with all the firearms, they soon became skilled marksmen, to the detriment of all the other tribes. The Haudenosaunee and the Dutch concluded a Caswentha, a friendship treaty, the so-called Two-Row Wampum Treaty, in a solemn ceremony by the Norman's Kill. The Belt of Peace, an intricately beaded deerskin belt, was held by the Haudenosaunee chieftains on one end and by the leaders of the New Netherland Company on the other end, symbolizing the unbreakable connection between the two tribes. One of the chiefs spoke, "You say that you are our father and I am your son. We say we will not be like father and son, but like brothers. This wampum belt confirms our words. Neither of us will make compulsory laws or interfere in the internal affairs of the other. Neither of us will try to steer the other's vessel. In 1618, the United New Netherland Company's charter expired, but the States General refused to extend it and told all the Dutch merchants, "Have at it." But since the New Netherland Company held all the trading posts and all the deals, they continued to thrive. Willem Usselings kept pushing his West India Company plans to anyone who would hear it, but the States General nixed his idea of properly organized colonies in the West Indies, just trading posts with a small military contingent for their protection. So, temporary trading posts and unregulated piracy, yay! Established colonies and agriculture with all the administrative hoopla, nay. Meanwhile, the Republic was a little distracted by a pending civil war. Two Protestant University of Leiden professors, Jacobus Arminius and Franciscus Gomarus, had a theological disagreement about, among other things, predestination. The argument divided the 7 states into Remonstrants and Counter-Remonstrants, or as we call them today, the Methodists and Calvinists. Each team went to their own church services to hear sermons from their own preachers. The rift grew when city after city took measures against church services and reverence of either team. The Republic was about to go to hell in a handbasket, where, according to Arminius, you'd end up because of your behavior on earth, but where Gomarus believed you ended up because the almighty and all-knowing God had decided you'd end up in before you were even born. Count Maurits of Nassau wanted to fix the rift with a national synod, a meeting of church elders to determine church policies for the entire Republic and all its domains. But Johan van Oldenbarnevelt said each state should determine church doctrine for itself. This path left the country wide open to Spanish influencers. Some states might even turn Roman Catholic and tell Spain to just come right in. The conflict kept escalating, with the Count publicly siding with the Calvinists and the Prime Minister undermining the rights of the stadholder by passing the Scherpe resolutie, the Sharp resolution. And Maurits was like, and I took that personally. He went around the Republic to replace all Barneveldian government members with his own supporters. Van Oldenbarnevelt tried to hold the line in the state of Holland, but in February 1618, Maurits' elder brother died, and he became the Prince of Orange, aka a God-appointed sovereign. The people generally listened to a member of a royal family over a mere commoner. Van Oldenbarnevelt was toast. In a final attempt to undermine the stadholder, the Prime Minister made a grave error in sending Holland delegates, Hugo de Groot among them, to the state of Utrecht to convince Utrecht to follow Holland in undermining the stadholder. That was treason under the Union of Utrecht. One fateful morning in August 1618, Maurits had Oldenbarnevelt and his cronies, Hugo de Groot among them, arrested at his home, the stadholder's quarters in The Hague, for high treason, land treason, and lèse majesty. After something that we today would not recognize as a trial, all men were convicted, though only Johan van Oldenbarnevelt's head rolled, literally, on May 13, 1619. Soon after, the National Synod in Dordrecht established the Dordtse leerregels, or Canons of Dordrecht. All people in the Republic and all its colonies must follow the Calvinist religion. Gomarus for the win. End of. Sort of. The Republic enjoyed freedom of conscience. The public religion was Calvinism, but in private, behind closed doors, you could have any religion you wanted. As a result, the Netherlands became a safe haven for the religiously persecuted of the world. One of these religious refugee groups came from England, the Pilgrims. England had its own religious issues. Many groups believed that the Church of England was too closely tied to the government, that it had strayed from the true Christian teachings, and was, well, too Roman Catholic. While the Puritans tried to reform the church from within, others created their own independent congregations. King James I started exiling religious dissidents in England left and right using the Seditious Sectaries Act of 1593. Many separatists moved to the Republic of the Netherlands, home of many a refugee. Leiden in particular was popular. 1/3 of its population were refugees. There were Walloons, Huguenots, Baptists, Fifth Monarchy men, Ashkenazi Jews, and all the religious flavors you can think of. Leiden was also the publishing hub of Europe for many scientists and writers. The Republic, rather unusual at this time, not only had freedom of conscience, but also freedom of the press. It's estimated that at this time, half the books published worldwide were printed in the Netherlands. Using this press freedom, the English separatists printed pamphlets slamming King James's intolerant religious rules and smuggled them into England. And there wasn't a thing the king could do about it. Still, the separatists weren't on board with this whole freedom of conscience thing, though. They were worried the Republic's big melting pot would eventually dissolve their pure congregation. One group, today called the Pilgrims, they weren't called that at the time, wanted to settle in New Netherland. But the States General and the Prince of Orange didn't want an agricultural colony in New Netherland. The war was about to restart, and they couldn't afford to fund a military escort to protect them. For now, only trading posts were allowed. Sorry. The separatists were like, "We're still going!" and made arrangements with the Virginia Company of Plymouth to found their colony. In December 1620, the Mayflower landed north of New Netherland, where the Pilgrims founded the New Plymouth Colony. Some claim that the Pilgrims ended up there against their will and that the Dutch had bribed the Mayflower captain to ditch them far away from the Hudson River. But this isn't true. Incidentally, the few hundred separatists who remained in the Republic eventually did dissolve into the melting pot of Dutch society. In 1621, the 12-year truce between the Republic and Spain was up for renewal. The Republic was split between the frontline states who'd see the most conflict and the merchant states who experienced an economic slump during the truce. The Spanish didn't want to restart the war either. They'd just gotten involved in the war next door in the Habsburg Empire, known today as the 30 Years' War. But they felt they'd gotten a bad deal and wanted to renegotiate terms. The talks began. Then, on March 31, 1621, just 9 days before the truce expired, King Felipe III of Spain, Portugal, etc., passed away. His nearly 16-year-old son Felipe succeeded him. Rey Felipe IV de España's Pálido, or First Minister, Gaspar de Guzmán y Pimentel Ribera y Velasco de Toba Conde de Olivares, was a big fan of Felipe's grandfather's vision of a united Roman Catholic Netherlands and wanted all them rebel states back in the Spanish realm. No more talking. And so, midnight on April 10, 1621, the war resumed. Holland and Zeeland were like, "Woo! West India Company, West India Company, West India Company, let's go!" Sure enough, that same day, Prince Maurits of Orange had the plan ready to go. The States General had already sidelined Usselings and his plan for an actual colony, and the prince ordered the founding of the Geoctrooieerde West-Indische Compagnie, a trading company/naval war machine, VOC style. On June 3, 1621, the West India Company was granted a 24 years trade monopoly in the West Indies. West Africa was added on account of the salt trade because of the renewed Spanish blockade of the Portuguese harbors. After these 24 years, the States General would vote to extend it or not. It was made in the VOC's image, with one notable exception. Like the VOC counterparts, the company had exclusive power to create and govern colonies and establish trade, but they had to use a distinctly more military approach to do this. To gain access to colonies and ports, they had to fight the Spanish and Portuguese for them. They also had to disrupt their salt, sugar, and slave trade, and intercept the Spanish silver fleet, laden with silver, gold, and other valuable products harvested, received, plundered, retrieved from the West to fund Spain's wars. The company was ruled by the Heren 19, the 19 gentlemen with 4 chambers who would execute their orders: Amsterdam, Zeeland, Rotterdam, and Hoorn. After some haggling, Friesland and Groningen were also allowed to have a chamber. The States General also had a vote. The New Netherland Company was allowed to trade for 4 more years. Its last ship departed the colony in 1624, and the West India Company took all their posts. The West India Company's territory stretched from West Africa to Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. Time to pull the wolf's teeth. It took the West India Company a year to perfect its internal organization, and another year to get the funds and operations in order to equip its first expeditions. The new company's very first ships headed for West Africa and Brazil to execute the Groot Design, the Grand Plan, expand territory, trade, and upset the salt, sugar, and slave trade of the Spanish and Portuguese. The first ship that the company sent to New Netherland to scout the land a bit was the Makreel, commanded by Captain Daniel van Kriekenbeek. He first swung by the Caribbean for a bit to hunt the Spanish and Portuguese for sport and arrived in December 1623. He was in for a surprise. A French ship was anchored at the mouth of the river. Bonjour! We are here to stake a claim for King Louis XIII of France. Pardonnez-moi? The Makreel and a yacht equipped with 2 cannons safely guided the Frenchmen out of the river and into the ocean. Not a shot was fired. Au revoir! In the Republic, the English wanted a word. The territory was obviously theirs. Why? Reasons. The Dutch figured they needed at least 50 colonists to lay a proper claim on the territory, and they needed to build forts to protect everyone against English encroachers. The entire job was outsourced to the Amsterdam Chamber of the Company that quickly split into 2 factions. The idealist colony faction and the realist trade-only faction. The idealists wanted to expand the Republic's territory and bring the Calvinist faith to the unknown peoples. The realists wanted to make a quick buck and scram. While they duked it out, the call to find colonists went out. Well, that turned out easier said than done. Plenty of merchants, skippers, sailors, accountants, carpenters, armorers, and soldiers signed up for a New Netherlands adventure, but settlers to actually live there, occupy the claimed territory, and run the trading posts while everyone else came and went, proved hard to find. Things were relatively good in Old Netherland, and few were ignorant, desperate, or poor enough to relocate to some unknown wilderness. The WIC promised everyone who went over a piece of land in exchange for 6 years of service. They also promised to send plenty of women along. And free passage for everybody. Huh? How does that sound? Pretty great, huh? But the Dutch were like, nah, we're good. Initially, only war refugees, like Walloon immigrants from the south of the Low Countries, were interested. Before boarding, all immigrants had to swear an oath of allegiance to the West India Company and the States General, vow to sell beaver skins to the company at a set price, and promise to publicly profess the Reformed religion. But do whatever you want in the privacy of your home. Cool? Cool. They were given plenty of supplies to defend the place, and the instructions were explicit. It is first of all necessary that they be placed in a good defensive position and well provided with forts and arms, since the Spaniard, who claims all the country, will never allow anyone to gain a possession there. Meanwhile, in the East Indies, the Dutch and English merchants were getting on each other's nerves. VOC Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen was constantly fighting the English, who had the annoying habit of setting up shop after the VOC cleared a path in the wilderness. When the fights threatened to unleash an Anglo-Dutch war in Europe, the national government stepped in. King James and the States General concluded a Treaty of Defense, a trade cooperation. They divided the East Indies market and set some ground rules. However, Governor-General Koen wasn't exactly on board and relentlessly pursued trade deals with the local population. In 1623, Koen was on his way home when his supposed English plot against the VOC merchants was discovered on Ambon. After a little torture, several Englishmen from the nearby Spice Islands were implicated in the dastardly plot and were promptly arrested. The VOC court sentenced those who confessed, 10 Englishmen, 9 Japanese, and 1 Portuguese, to death. The English back home were so flippin' mad. The VOC could kiss any Anglo-Dutch trade corporation goodbye. The VOC was like, oh no. Anyway, while the company was embarrassed by the affair, they ruled it a fatal industrial accident. Well, the EIC was big mad and unleashed a huge diplomatic row between England and the Republic. The VOC offered to do a joint investigation to prove the Dutch had handled everything in accordance with the Defense Treaty, but the English remained bitter. And when I say bitter, I mean that whenever the English were upset about something the Dutch did or didn't do, the Amboina Massacre, as they called it, which it wasn't, was trotted out. They proclaimed loud and clear the Dutch were devious, dangerous, and, well, dicks. The first West India Company ship to sail from the Republic to New Netherland to deliver colonists was the Eendracht, the Unity, which brought over 5 or 6 families, most likely Walloons. The West India Company appointed Cornelis Jacobsen Maai as temporary director of the new Netherland colony. He brought over 100 people, some 30 families, again mostly Walloons, aboard the Nieuw Nederland and dropped everyone off on an island just below Manhattan Island. The Munsee called it Pagank, Nut Island, on account of the walnut and chestnut trees. The Dutch called it Noten Eiland. Today, it's Governor's Island. To properly stake the Dutch claims, the company scattered all settlers over a wide area and Maai assigned everyone a location. Incidentally, you see Nova Belgica on the map? That has nothing to do with today's Belgium. It's just the Latinized name of Nieuw Nederland. In the north, 18 families created a settlement on the western bank of the North Mauritius or Hudson River near today's Albany. 2 families and 6 men settled at Zeebroek on the Fresh River, today the Connecticut River. Some went to the south, now Delaware River, and settled on Verhulst Island. But when the bay froze during the winter, they moved north. Several Walloons settled on Staten Eiland, named in honor of the Staten-Generaal, the States General of the Republic, now Staten Island. Their isolated location was a little too isolated, so they moved to the northern shore of the Lange Eiland, now Long Island. They built log cabins on the banks and called it de Waalbocht, now Wallabout Bay. The rest of the families remained on Noten Eiland. The makeshift homes were mostly just square pits in the ground, lined with wood and covered with bark roofs. You couldn't stand up in them, and a visiting reverend later called them hovels and holes. They felled trees to construct palisade defenses. And after they cleared the land, the colonists discovered it was incredibly fertile, and the grain they sowed grew as high as a man. Ships sailed over from the home country, Ubering stuff that the settlers ordered: tools, cloth, cutlery, as well as cows, sheep, and horses, but also a bunch of new immigrants. The Amsterdam's Chamber colony faction had won, sort of, only in so much that the colony was built up to protect trade. So everyone's a winner. Maai built a bunch of forts. He replaced the destroyed Nassau Fort near Albany with het Fort van Oranje, Fort Orange, on the North River, built the Wilhelmus Fort and a new Fort Nassau on the South River, and placed another fort on Noten Eiland to house the colony's central administration. The colonists were well pleased with the gorgeous country, with delicious fruits and fertile farmland, with beautiful rivers, bubbling fountains flowing down into the valleys, basins of running waters in the flatlands. Had we cows, hogs, and other cattle fit for food, which we daily expect in the first ships, we would not wish to return to Holland, for whatever we desire in the paradise of Holland is here to be found. This influencer report was printed on pamphlets, the newspapers of the time, to inspire more people in the Republic to make the journey. In January 1625, the West India Company appointed Willem Verhulst from Antwerp as New Netherlands interim director, until another government shall be erected there at the pleasure of the company. Verhulst, who ruled the massive colony with his vice-director Adriaan Jorissen Tienpont, was instructed to focus on trade. Forget about the whole colony thing, and recall everyone to his central location, and build a fort on that southern tip of that Manhattan Island. Name it after us. Fort Amsterdam. Apparently, that trade-only faction won out. Except, the place needed farmers to produce their own food. So, come on people, get your act together. The company gave the director a bunch of detailed instructions to investigate the land, find minerals, do test drills, mark and sound all the waterways, and find a place for windmills. He had to do farming experiments and figure out which seeds grew best and where. Verhulst also received explicit instructions on how to engage with the Indians. He shall also see that no one do the Indians any harm or violence, deceive or mock them, or regard them with contempt in any way, but that in addition to good treatment, they be shown honesty, faithfulness, and sincerity in all contracts, dealings, and intercourse, without being deceived by a shortage of measure, weight, or number, and that friendly relations with them be maintained. The director was also told to help explorers explore and give them all the supplies. One of these adventurers was Peter Minuit, also called Minnewit. Minuit was a Dutch immigrant of Walloon parents born in Germany who'd moved to the Republic, where he'd become bored with his diamond cutter job and longed for some excitement. Since he had no interest in becoming a company man, he volunteered instead, wanting to explore the interior. A little later, Minuit was asked to join the General Councilors, a board of colonists and skippers who advised the company director. Early morning, on April 6, 1625, or March 27th English calendar, King James I died after a stroke. He was 58 years old. His 24-year-old son was now King Charles I of England, Scotland, and Ireland. While King James had made peace with Spain 2 decades earlier, his son Charles immediately declared war on Spain again. A week later, on April 23, 1625, Prince Maurits of Orange, Count of Nassau, etc., died from liver carcinoma. He was 57 years old. His heir and successor, his half-brother, 41-year-old Count Frederik Hendrik of Nassau, was elected stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel and became captain general of all the armies and navies. He continued the war that his late father, Prince Willem of Orange, had started nearly 60 years ago. Frederik Hendrik was a highly skilled military leader, a gifted diplomat, and also very, very ambitious. In August 1625, King Charles concluded a treaty with the Dutch to support their war. He promised to send them money and 35,000 troops. He would have done more, but, well, Amboina Massacre. Charles talked a good game, but his promises weren't worth much without his parliament's approval and money. Parliament didn't give him approval or money. So, Charles dissolved Parliament. He was a God-appointed ruler and everyone should obey him. And if his subjects couldn't, he'd rule alone. A love for the Dutch, for as far as he ever had any, quickly cooled when they refused to help him in the Habsburg War. Wow, those Dutch really are dicks. General Council member and volunteer explorer Peter Minuit had scouted the region and returned to the Republic to report all his findings to the company's Amsterdam chamber, and probably brought a few samples along. On May 4th, Minuit arrived back in New Netherland and found out that the other general councilors had been working behind the scenes to overthrow director Willem Verhulst. They accused him of brutal and arbitrary punishments for ripping off and bullying the Native Americans, and even more seriously, of stealing company money. The council put Verhulst on trial, convicted him, and voted him and his wife off the island. Verhulst, seething with rage, vowed to return with a foreign army and use his knowledge of the colony to seize it all. He never did. Spoilers. After this, in a process that wasn't entirely clear, Peter Minuit was placed in command by the council on account of the bad conduct of Verhulst. The newly minted director carried out company orders and recalled everyone to a centralized location, but he deemed Noten Eiland too small to support a settlement, and decided to move everything to Manhattan Island. It was ideally located for Indian trade. It had rich forests, fertile soil, and fresh water. It was large enough to support a growing colony, but small enough to defend it. In other words, it was the perfect island. So Minuit bought it. Or did he? The belief that Peter Minuit bought Manhattan, all 20,000 acres of it, from Native Americans for a trivial sum of 60 guilders, or $24 according to the calculations of a 19th century historian, is deeply entrenched in American history. While the Indians sold off many plots of land to English, Dutch, French, Spanish, and other European settlers, this one became the stuff of legends. It sounded absurd, disproportionate, and, well, totally evil. However, the Dutch didn't trick, enslave, nor push naive natives out of their land. Not here, not now. The Indians weren't duped. There was no permanent sale of the land. They didn't even believe in the European ideas of land ownership. This was a rental agreement which was tied to a treaty. The amount was the value of goods given in the exchange, and would have been worth about an 8-month salary of a soldier. Compare this to the value of the shipment of furs, 45,000 guilders, or 416 years of a soldier's monthly salary. Different Indian tribes often waged wars. Like every other neighboring group of people living on the planet ever, they formed alliances and made treaties and promised each other protection in exchange for the use of the land. The newcomers were welcomed as any other tribe. They were allowed to use the land in exchange for useful goods and military assistance. The Indians never ceased using the land, and whenever they set up camp on land that had been purchased, They demanded the royal treatment and plenty of gifts. The Dutch, who just needed a piece of paper they could wave in the faces of other European settlers, simply tolerated it. Later, the English didn't. The Manhattan Land Treaty included a ceremony, an exchange of gifts, the signing of a document, a celebration, the whole shebang. But the document, along with numerous official records from before 1638, were discarded during an 18th century scrap paper dump. We don't even know if Verhulst started talks for the sale, made the sale, or whether Minuit did it all. On November 5th, 1626, het Wapen van Amsterdam docked in Amsterdam. The ship delivered the banished director Verhulst, along with cargo and the latest news from Isaac de Razière, the colony's new secretary. Company official Pieter Schagen learned that they had acquired Manhattan from the Lenni Lenape Indians for goods worth 60 guilders. Schagen outlined the ship's cargo and the details of this purchase in a letter to Company HQ. This letter is now considered one of the most vital documents of early American history, New York State's founding document. Meanwhile, Peter Minuit officially named the settlement around Fort Amsterdam Nieuw Amsterdam, New Amsterdam.